there could be some friends now viewing who are coming either from the outside of Quranic studies or just beginning to learn about Quranic studies. So, Professor Nasser, could you start with first, not so much the canonization, but general traditional ideas about the revelation of the Quran? How does it work out between God, the angel Gabriel, and Muhammad, the process by which the Quran is revealed?
Okay, so very, very briefly, and we are here discussing again the Muslim perspective, of course, that the Quran, the collection, the book of the Quran was revealed over 20 or 23 years. Okay, so it didn't come at once. It was a revelation. It's understood to be the word of God. There are, of course, many theological arguments about what do we mean by the word of God, but it's a revelation from God to Muhammad. And it came through a mediation, and this mediation is the angel Gabriel. Okay,
right.
So there's no direct connection in a sense of speaking between God and the Prophet. It always occurred through Gabriel. Now there are maybe some accounts when during the ascension that maybe the Prophet saw God, or maybe he heard something from him. But the revelation of the Quran, the words of the Quran are
ascension being, sorry to jump in, but ascension being the Mi'raj, the
Mi'raj,
that the Prophet went to Jerusalem sometimes, or directly from Mecca to heaven.
Exactly. Yeah, thank you. And so that's a special case. But when we are talking about the revelation of the Quran, it's usually done through the mediation of the angel Gabriel. So that's important to understand. During the lifetime of the Prophet, Muslim sources, I don't want to say there's disagreement, but there is a general agreement that there was no collection of the Quran at the end of the when the Prophet died. This is when we are going to discuss later on the whole collection issues by Uthman and later on. So it's also important to understand that when Muhammad died, there was no collection, a codex. When we say codex, it means a book. Right. Maybe there were some sheets, maybe there were some records of certain chapters written here and there. But at least the consensus by Muslim scholars is that there was no collection of the book by the time that the Prophet died at the end.
Okay, and I mean, later tradition will establish various different ways of reading the basic or skeletal text of the Quran. And am I right that some of these differences in the various readings are sometimes understood to be original? That even the angel Gabriel taught Muhammad to read the Quran. We're not talking about major differences like an extra foot or a chapter or anything, but the angel Gabriel taught Muhammad to read the Quran in various ways.
Exactly. So the whole concept of the variant readings that we will discuss also later, it's basically grounded in the idea that the angel Gabriel, when he was relaying the Quran to Muhammad, he was reciting it. So it's almost teacher and student. So the whole teacher and student link that we find today, it's also, if you want, grounded in the idea that Gabriel was teaching Muhammad the Quran in the same sense. Okay. And there is a tradition, as you mentioned, that in order to justify those variant readings, some of them are substantial. Some of them have to do with dots, with vowels, with different grammatical structures. Some of them are a matter of dialect. In order to justify the validity or legitimacy of these variant readings, we also have a tradition that says that during the year when the Prophet died, Gabriel came and he reviewed the Quran with him in those 7 different ways, or ahruf, modes or modulations. So also the concept of the variant readings, it also has its legitimacy from Gabriel teaching the Prophet all these different ways. We can discuss it later if you want. I will keep my answers short and then if you want me to discuss further, I will, because I know that there are other questions. But
there are a lot of
questions. I will stop here. Yeah.
There are a lot of questions.
Yeah.
Great. Okay. My second introductory question is about sort of the next phase. So revelation comes first, and then sort of the pedagogical role of the angel Gabriel instructing Muhammad how to recite. There are also, I think, accounts that you speak about of the Prophet. I mean, you speak about the question of whether some of the text was in fact written down over the Prophet's lifetime. And there are these scribes of the revelation in some reports, and Muhammad sort of directs them even in sort of the editing process. So could we sort of maybe start there, working our way up to the tradition of Uthman's role?
Right.
There are also traditions that bits and pieces of the Quran here and there were written on different materials, including flat stones and things. So yeah, could you take us through that next phase from the Prophet's own role to Uthman's role?
Okay, so again, we will work through what the Muslim sources say. We say that there's a general agreement that the Quran was not collected in a book by the time that the Prophet died. However, we also have many accounts under the chapter of the collection of the Quran, or spread through different works of the biography of the Prophet, or tafsir, exegesis, etc., that there were certain phases of writing. Okay, so every now and then you will hear that people are holding something and reading from it. You will read in certain cases that the Prophet was waiting for certain verses to be abrogated. So abrogation is a big deal. We can't discuss it now, but there's a concept that there are verses that are revealed and they are abrogated. Okay, so one of the reasoning behind the Prophet not collecting the Quran, according to Muslim sources, is that he was waiting for the revelation to end, because the revelation was still open.
Right.
There was no need to collect the Quran, because
it was always possible something could come that abrogated an earlier.
Exactly. So there was this kind of waiting for the verses to be abrogated. Is this going to be abrogated or not? And this is why the Quran was not collected in one place. Also, the way that the verses are, the current collection of the Quran we have, it's not chronological. Okay, the arrangement of the chapter. So it goes from the longest chapter to the shortest one, which is not helpful, of course, for historians, because they need a chronological order for the Quran. So this is also one of the issues in the collection of the Quran, is that some companions preferred a chronological arrangement of the Quran. Now we come to Uthman. During Uthman's time, when the Quran was collected, it was not collected in a term of which was the first chapter that was collected and what was the last chapter. Now, so we end with the Prophet. The Prophet dies. There's no tangible collection or codex.
Right.
Okay, right. And then we have the first caliph, Abu Bakr. Okay, so the Prophet dies. Sorry, I work with the Islamic calendar, so right. He dies 11, maybe it's 632, 631, 632.
Yeah, Christian date. Yeah.
So he and then Abu Bakr comes, and during Abu Bakr there was the famous Hurub al-Ridda, okay, the apostasy wars in the south in Yemen. And what happened there is that, according to the sources, that many Quran readers, reciters, or memorizers of the Quran, they died during this battle. Okay. Now, some sources say they were 70. Some of them say 700 died during this battle. We don't know. Because of this, Abu Bakr and the second caliph Umar, they agreed to collect the Quran so that the Quran will not be lost. Okay. So they were afraid that so many memorizers of the Quran died, and there was a need to collect it. And this is what is known as the first collection. The first official collection is during the caliphate of Abu Bakr. Okay, so they commissioned Zayd bin Thabit, who was our companion. He knew how to read and write. He knew Syriac, allegedly, and Hebrew also. And the Prophet actually told him to go and learn Syriac. He went and he learned Syriac in 21 days, which is great, right? So he was very smart. Yeah,
I've been working on it for almost 21 years.
Yeah, so he learned it only in 21 days, or maybe in less than that amount, something like that. So this is the first collection. Now, again, Muslim scholars distinguish between the first collection and the second collection by Uthman, which we'll also very quickly discuss, is that it was not a codex, okay? It was not a mushaf. So the Quran was collected from this material that you mentioned, flat stones, parchment, shoulder camels.
Yes.
Exactly, shoulder camels and memory. Okay, صدور الرجال, so the hearts of man. So it was basically relying on written and oral material to collect the Quran. So these were collected. Zayd bin Thabit, the head of the committee, he collected these in sheets. Okay, not codex, and the wording is very, I don't say accurate, but it's like suhuf, it's scrolls or sheets. And these
not
were
thrown together, not bound together into one.
They don't say. It's just sheets, okay? And it doesn't say mushaf, it doesn't say codex, it doesn't say a book. It doesn't talk about arrangements also of the chapters, whether they were arranged in a certain order or not. They were just collected. All this material was collected in sheets, and then Abu Bakr kept them. And then when he died, he gave them to Umar, okay, the second caliph. And when the second caliph died, they passed on to his daughter, okay, Hafsa. And that's one also problematic issue, that why they go to Hafsa and why don't they go to the third caliph? Because it's a matter of state, it's not a personal matter. So they go to Hafsa. Uthman comes. When Uthman comes, I think around when? So Abu Bakr 3 years, Umar I think 11. He comes around 23.
644 is sort of the AD CE date.
Yeah, so he comes around 23 Hijri, and then the second collection starts probably 2 years after. So around, let's say, year 25 Hijri. Okay, and the second narrative, very very shortly, is that someone came to him and told him that he heard Muslims disagreeing greatly in the manner that they are reciting the Quran. So this is during the conquest of Armenia and Azerbaijan. Hudayfa ibn al-Yaman, he came to Medina and he told Uthman that they are disagreeing. You should do something about this, because Muslims are disagreeing in the Quran. Protect the Quran or guard it before they disagree, similar to how Christians and Jews disagree in their book.
Yeah, I think that's an important point. If I can interrupt, right? Please jump in on that point, because there is sort of the flavor or the whiff of sectarian concerns in some of these reports. I'm not sure. Maybe you'll disagree with that point, but the idea is that the Quran itself seems to allude to problems of the preservation of the revelation to Moses and Jesus among Jews and Christians. There's all this language sort of summed up in the Arabic word tahrif, but there's other words like tabdil and other sorts of words. So tahrif meaning maybe generally falsification, tabdil, exchanging or exchange. So I mean, would you agree with that? That at least there's a note in these traditions that is concerned with the superior preservation of the Quran vis-a-vis the Bible.
No, I 100% agree with you. And I mean, the issue here is we could have two ways of looking at hadith. Okay, so you have one way, which is the traditional way, that you have a chain of transmission, it's all sound, and then it goes back to the Prophet or the companions, right? Now you have the other way, which is, I don't want to call it modern, secondary scholarship or European scholarship, but it's a way of how does the hadith reflect certain circumstances that were happening during the day. So when you are talking about sectarian issues and the concept of tahrif, this was really a later development in terms of discussions about the preservation of the Quran, or why the Quran is superior to the Bible in that sense. So you could really tell, these little remarks that they reflect certain discussions that they were happening later on and not necessarily happening early on. Okay, similar to, for example, the issue of the first collection. So when Zayd bin Thabit was collecting this material, the very famous last verse of Surah At-Tawbah, that he was looking around and he only found it with one person. This is Abu Khuzayma al-Ansari, right? So the last verse in Surah At-Tawbah. And this was very problematic for Muslim scholars. How could you authenticate or verify the Quran through one person only? Okay.
Surah At-Tawbah, chapter 9, Surah 9 of the Quran.
Exactly. So, and this is like, there are tons of discussions in Muslim sources about how could you authenticate one verse from Abu Khuzayma, and it's only one person. And there are several ways to solve it. Lo and behold, you get a hadith saying that the testimony of Abu Khuzayma equals two people, right? But also there are other ways of justifying it, saying, well, they found it written with Abu Khuzayma, but it didn't mean that people did not memorize it. Okay. But this whole discussion is a reflection of a legal issue, is the testimony of two people, right? So when you start really checking the development of what was happening in society back then, the testimony of two people, how important it is, the whole discussion of khabar al-wahid, the narration from one person or from a single chain of transmission. These issues are later developments, and you could really date the hadith and these narrations by how these small issues are reflected in these developments.
Right.
So I agree with you 100% that these sectarian issues in the hadith, they are really a reflection of what was happening later on, and it's more a concern of the superiority or the why the Quran is more authentic or more accurate than the books of the Jews and Christians.
Right. Because the issue of preservation is itself an element of the arguments for the validity of the Quran. So it's not only the content, or even as some ideas of the inimitability of the Quran would have it, the beauty or the grammatical perfection of the text, but it's also the subsequent history of the text that God protected it. I think there's a verse in chapter 15 of the Quran that speaks of God, at least how it's usually understood, if you understand the verb there. Yeah.
No, I 100% I agree. And also, it's one of the main arguments that comes later on by theologians arguing against mostly Christians about the Bible, is that our book is better than your book. Yeah, you received the revelation, but it's falsified. And it's corrupted, but our version, it's not corrupted. So this is why you have to become Muslim, because we have the true revelation in that sense. I'm simplifying it, but more or less, it's really a huge argument in the early debates between Christians and Muslims, theologians.
So then, to circle back to Hudhayfa, he's come from the outskirts of Azerbaijan or Armenia or somewhere back to Medina. He's sort of exhorting the Caliph Uthman to come up with a text, or presumably a codex, for the sake of the unity of Muslims, and from there.
Exactly. And then Uthman heeds his words, and then he commissioned Zayd bin Thabit again, the same person who collected the Quran during the first collection, and they come up with what we call the Uthmanic collection, right? Now, what's important about this collection is that it is a codex, right? And it's an official codex. And what's more important is that he made copies of them. Okay, so the first collection, well, you have to if you are observing Muslim and you believe the traditions in Bukhari, okay, you have to take it. This is a sound hadith, and then it happened, right? But the issue with the second, why the second collection is more important, because it became really a state matter, where Uthman made copies and sent them to different regions in the Muslim world. So what Abu Bakr and Umar did, they just made the copy, and that's it. And so what's the point of the copy if you are not showing it to other companions or other Muslims? You are making a copy, you are collecting it, and then you are keeping it with you without making other copies to other companions. But what happened with Uthman is that he made a prototype, and then he made copies of it, 5 or 4 or 5 or 7 or 11 different versions, and then he sent them to different areas. He sent some accounts say he sent even one to Egypt, some accounts say he sent one to Al-Bahrain, one to Oman, and of course the Medina, Mecca, and Iraq. So that's why the Uthmanic, if you want, canonization or codification is important, because it came at a state level, and it really propagated the Uthmanic recension throughout the Muslim world.
Right. And it's accompanied also by a concern, and maybe right after this, maybe the last question that I ask, and then we'll turn to questions submitted on YouTube, and maybe Hassan, if you want to jump in. But it's accompanied with a concern not only for the dissemination, as you say, a state-sponsored text of the Quran, but also a wariness or attentiveness to the complications presented by the other collections of the Quran, not that, as you say, of the sheets of Abu Bakr, Omar, Hafsa,
Uh-huh.
but those of other companions. So I mean, part of the state policy was not only to disseminate Uthman's text,
Right.
but to eliminate the other variant versions.
Exactly. And again, you as a historian, you have to look at the politics of what's happening. Okay. Again, as a observing Muslim, you believe that the companions were doing the best for the community, and they were all above these political, if you want, disputes, which history, it teaches us otherwise. But especially during the collection of Uthman, this story about Hudayfa, there are other versions of the story or commentary on the story that says that he got so angry, Hudayfa, when he heard people saying the reading of Ibn Mas'ud is this, and the reading of Abu Musa al-Ash'ari is that. Okay. And the people of Kufa, they are arguing against the people of Basra. So this is even way before the canonical reading. So there was even a kind of, if you want, regional / political dispute happening between people. So if I have a codex, if I'm Ibn Mas'ud, I want people to read my codex, my version. And if I'm Abu Musa al-Ash'ari, I want people to read my version. So Uthman comes and said, I'm eliminating all these companions' codices, and I'm unifying Muslims according to
right. It's very, very interesting. Yes.
And thus we can understand Ibn Mas'ud's frustration. We can talk about that later, and other companions who were not happy with what Uthman did, because they have their own codices. So why are you forcing everyone to use your codex in that sense? But again, politics is very important, and we should really consider these political and historical / social issues when we are looking at these narratives.